Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and on behalf of Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, AI in the Library, Balancing Use and Institutional Adoption of Digital Tools, which is sponsored by Clarivate. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. I'm so sorry if you can hear a leaf blower in the background. Hopefully not. Um, okay, great. Now I'll just put a couple of links in the chat to register for upcoming webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Also, if you're interested in library technology, LibTech Insights, or LTI, is a content vertical from Choice that examines the day-to-day impact of library and education technology on academic librarians, researchers, and students. The channel provides practical guidance on technology trends and products, including AI and AI literacy, user experience, useful tools, and job profiles, all of which are written for and by librarians. And you can sign up for the newsletter or read the LTI blog via the links in the chat. Okay, and now before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit any questions or comments for our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the Show Captions button on the bottom panel of your screen. You can also turn on automated translation for the captions by clicking the arrow button, toggling on translation, and selecting your preferred language. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with links to the recording and the slides. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Mark.
Great, thanks a ton, Sabrina. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the slides. Thanks for joining our session today. We're going to discuss a pretty broad range of topics that all revolve around the use and implementation of AI resources, especially the library's roles in governance and adoption of them. First, I want to introduce our panelists, myself included. My name is Mark Cormier. I'm the Director of Product Management at ProQuest, a part of Clarivate. I focus mostly on larger aggregation products, as well as the ProQuest Research Assistant. I'm joined by Rachel Clark, our Collections and Strategy Assessment Librarian at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, at the Undergraduate Library. And she'll have a chance to introduce herself in just a few moments. We're also joined by Stephen Kemsley, who's the Senior Manager of the User Experience Design Team at Clarivate. And we've invited him to talk a little bit about some of the research that he's been doing and some of the things he's learned through that research around the user feedback, but also user behaviors and understanding how we can best serve needs through our research assistant that has been developed since 2024. So let me just move on. The first thing I've walked through this a little bit already. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of outreach projects that we had through Clarivate. So two major outreach and education projects from 2025. Rachel is going to talk about some of her insights around AI and digital literacy at Wayne State at the Undergraduate Library. And Stephen's going to round out the session by talking through some of the user research his team's done in support of the ProQuest Research Assistant. So if you were with us in the spring, in March of 2025, we talked about a number that was pretty shocking. This is the ACRL webinar about student use of AI tools in the classroom. And I cited a Digital Education Council survey from 2024 that talked about 86% of students were actively using AI tools in the course of their research. That number felt high, and it was high, but it has continued to grow since 2022, and this year was no exception. According to CopyLeaks in 2025, nearly 90% of students are using AI for academic purposes, but a third of those are using it daily. So we see not only the number of students using AI tools increasing, but the frequency in which they're using them is also growing. So in October 2025, where we're at today, the majority of students, they're turning to AI at least weekly for coursework. And the majority of students are reporting that they're using AI more this year than they were last year. We also know that tools continue to grow. New tools are introduced, existing ones continue to evolve. ChatGPT, though, has been at the top of the usage heap by a pretty wide margin since its inception in 2022. Student use continues to focus on those areas to support early stages of their research. So a lot of it is brainstorming ideas. It might be generating initial drafts. But we know use cases prior to ChatGPT, like through Grammarly, are focusing on spelling checks and understanding grammar and quality of grammar. But students are using it to solve math problems now, even writing their own code. So the numbers that we see from a percentage standpoint all talk to AI being used as a learning partner and not just as a shortcut for finishing assignments, which can all give us hope. Students also are pretty straightforward in terms of their goals. It's around wanting to save time, but they also wanted to increase the quality and improve the quality of their work. So as far as concerns with this change, we've heard a lot of information, a lot of feedback around academic integrity that continues to rule the day as far as the top concern around unmitigated use by students of AI. There's a lot of aspects to that concern, though, including some that are almost universally experienced, things like over-reliance on AI to do coursework, but also citing things that simply don't exist. We see these things pretty frequently. A lack of governance or just uneven governance is also a huge problem. Students struggle to navigate through the boundaries of the use of these tools. And in some cases, not using generative AI to support coursework is having a negative impact on their grades and their student experience. At Clarivate, we started developing a variety of research assistant models over the last couple of years, releasing late last year. But through that work, it became clear that there was also a big gap in understanding what LLMs do and how they can be applied by librarians, by faculty and students to more effectively use that in the support of research, but also do it in a responsible way. We've worked with many institutions and libraries in developing these research assistants, and we saw an opportunity to bring their knowledge about the AI landscape to an audience of fellow librarians. So you may have been also aware of the AI coursework that we created, but we sponsored, or we worked with ACRL and Choice to develop an 8-week series. It's an email series, like a mini course. It's designed to educate and inform librarians and the community about all things AI. But it also includes contributions from academic librarians that have a deep understanding of their week's theme across these lessons. So you'll have their voice within each of these lessons on a weekly basis. It was, and it continues to be, a really popular resource. The feedback that we've received from users really helps illustrate the state of AI assessment and the adoption of it at their institutions. So there are some major things that we learned. We tried to bucket this into 8 major areas. So the 8 insights that we learned really came from a lot of feedback through the course and through engagement with users and people that were taking the course. There's over 800 comments across the life of the course today. And they're all categorized, as you see on the screen today. Librarians see a clear role for themselves as guides for AI use on campus. The goal with helping students and faculty use it responsibly, but also embedding it into information literacy work that they're doing themselves, and then also providing some of those guardrails for responsible use on campus. We also know that there's a huge impact on the lack of consistent AI policies across some campuses. Some have rules, others don't, but librarians want clear, concise, practical guidance that they can point to when they're talking about governance and what those guardrails are. There's also a strong focus on teaching ethical use in general, but not banning AI outright. So there's concerns about plagiarism, there's concerns about bias, privacy came up repeatedly, but the prevailing view is that tools should not be banned, but rather taught for ethical use, but also having the tools with which to do so. There's a strong demand for practical training as a byproduct of this, both for librarians themselves and for students that they support. They want workshops, teaching materials. You want ready-to-use resources, but time and confidence are major hurdles, especially if there's that knowledge gap around what LLMs do and how they can be practically applied to coursework. But we did hear that there is an appetite for small, kind of quick wins and tangible steps for staying relevant and moving forward. Things like updating libguides, drafting policy templates, being a part of the policy conversation, hosting workshops, and even partnering with vendors for pilots to kind of keep the momentum moving forward, even when policy is struggling to adapt. Evaluation continues to be difficult without set guidelines and metrics for defining and assessing these tools in general. When assessing tools, librarians want to focus on practical criteria like usability, cost, transparency about the data sources. Audit trails are also really important, and provenance of the data is very important. Some of the barriers, enablers include things like budget, staffing, unclear institutional policies around governance. But positives and enablers include reskilling, where there is strong governance, it's valued and useful, but also clear leadership support from the top down. So if there's a mandate that they can follow in terms of implementing these AI tools, that obviously leads to a greater and quicker degree of success. And we're going to talk through a report that we ran, the Pulse of the Library report, that's going to talk more about what that leadership support should look like. So the future outlook is, it's a mix of optimism and apprehension. Some see AI as a really powerful assistant that could help personalize learning. Others worry about job cuts. Over reliance on the technology is certainly a big concern. But there is interest in emerging areas like agentic AI, where it can be used to solve kind of the more mundane tasks that you do at the library side, where it can drive efficiency and save you time as well in your day-to-day operations. So we'll talk about the Pulse of the Library report. I am going to include a link to the 8-week course, the information literacy course, in just a moment. There'll be a couple of opportunities for you to scan that QR code if you'd like to participate. That is an open course. So the Pulse of the Library report, it's an annual report. It combines feedback from both a survey, but also qualitative interviews with over 2,000 respondents this year from around the world. It covers academic, state, and public libraries at large, but it aims to provide that pulse of current trends, concerns and opportunities in the library community, but there's a particular focus on technology change and a larger focus on AI. So you can see some of the metrics here. The annual survey went over, we brought back 2,000 responses plus. We continue to get responses back that are after the close of the survey, but over 2,000 librarians worldwide participated, the majority in North America, mostly skewing towards academic libraries, but really good representation. It was also developed in 5 languages to increase that appeal. So let's talk about some of the basics. We're going to get into some of the individual stats, and you may hear perhaps your own thoughts reflected in some of the stats I'm going to share in just a moment. See how I'm doing on time. So there's a cautious but steady increase in AI adoption. Over 60% of respondents are evaluating or planning for AI integration today. And this aligns with the most recent ARL poll, which found an increasing number of libraries actively implementing or exploring AI today. I've already mentioned about the AI literacy knowledge gap, something that we hope to support through that mini course. Libraries recognize this, and in this survey, over half of respondees also highlighted that growing need. There were some regional differences in terms of the feedback and some of the concerns and kind of driving risks that they see at institutions. Asia and Europe are leading the way with adoption of AI tools, especially where native languages are supported. And I'll talk about some of those regional differences in some of the stats I'm going to share in just a moment. So for those libraries that are actively evaluating or planning to implement AI technologies, their objectives align closely with what we consider common library goals and priorities. The top objectives were to support students' learning, but also support research excellence, high quality research, and also to make content more discoverable. That focus is also reflected in the top 5 use cases that libraries are most interested in implementing. So across the majority of respondents, They feel that content discoverability and accessibility are areas where AI could have the most positive impact. I'm going to talk about this slide in a bit more detail in just a moment. So there are lots of primary concerns and challenges that were brought up through the course of this survey. But if you get a chance to download the full report, you're going to note that there is some optimism, considerable optimism about the potential positive impact of AI in academia. The survey found that 42% of respondents felt that AI can help automate routine tasks. So it was more inward focused toward the library and their roles. But also allows librarians to focus on strategic and creative activities, including the support of AI tools within the curriculum and student support of AI tools. That optimism was tempered a little bit by concerns that we've already talked about, especially the skills gap. So anticipating a need for upskilling was pretty prevalent. Well over half of respondents noticed that that is going to be something that is going to impact their jobs and how much work they have to do to support AI in the future. Respondents in the US show higher levels of uncertainty about AI impact on jobs compared to other regions, especially in Asia and Europe, where there's less concern about job displacement due to AI than other regions. Similarly, you'll also notice from this graph that the lack of expertise is definitely identified as the greatest concern that respondents face in adopting AI or assistive technologies. Although some libraries plan to develop development opportunities like workshops or online courses, almost a third stated that no training is available currently. And that actually rose to 43% among US respondents. So not only is there a clear lack of resources and training, there is a higher degree of need and awareness for upskilling in those regions. Similar to broader industry and governmental concerns, privacy and security and research integrity are really top concerns, especially for academic libraries. Let's see. Move on to this slide. So where does your library currently stand in terms of implementing AI tools and these technologies? So a majority of libraries are exploring and evaluating at this point. But as you can see, year over year, there's been considerable growth of those that are exploring or beginning that discovery phase to actually doing early implementation or finalizing that implementation. So we see that there is a considerable increase in early adopters and the continued work that they do. We also noted across respondents that there's a heavy regional influence in terms of what these answers are. So those from the US are more likely to be at the earlier stages of exploration. Some have no plans at this point. So there is a bit of a lag on the US and the North American side in terms of adoption and getting things moving. Every other region, they're more likely to be in later phases of implementation. As you can imagine, academic libraries are a lot more prevalent in terms of their implementation or their plans to versus public libraries. Public libraries, while they're not really implementing AI to the degree, they do continue to have a desire to upskill and to be aware of what these technologies are, especially in terms of being able to impact their roles and do some of the tasks that they'd like to have agentic AI perform on their behalf. So finally, talking about primary concerns that you face and these respondents faced in terms of large-scale AI implementation technology, budget constraints, by no surprise, was one of the greatest concerns. Privacy and security were followed fairly closely, but we also noticed some differences between 2025 and 2024, especially in areas of technology limitations, also the digital divide, also talking about things like misinformation and bias. Those are becoming a lot more recognizable and bigger concerns as more students are using these tools and as libraries are beginning to implement more of them. Respondents from the United States and the UK appear to have more concerns about AI in general, and those are mostly around the qualitative and the accuracy and the bias concerns that we note in the chart here. Respondents from Asia and the rest of the world are really focused on the lack of expertise and the budget constraints and technical issues versus the kind of qualitative issues of generative AI. Privacy and security continue to be at the top of the concern for public libraries, as you can imagine. But academic libraries, a far greater number, are concerned about budget constraints versus the privacy and security aspect of their concerns. Research integrity and technical limitations are at a top concern for public libraries and academic libraries, especially, as you can see. And if you read the further report, there's additional details around the regional differences in the answers and responses to specific questions that I'm mentioning here. So I do want to make sure that you have access not only to the state of the library. Whoops, let me get back one slide, Rachel, sorry, before you get there. The AI literacy micro course continues to be available. You see the link here. By all means, take it. It's 8 weeks. You'll get a new email every Monday that'll talk through a new theme with a new librarian representing the material. The Pulse of the Library report with a lot more detail than I've talked about today is going to be available on October 30th. This is the QR code for that. I'm going to add another slide at the end, so you'll be able to capture these QR codes if you miss it right now. But first, I'd like to kick it over to Rachel Clark, who's our guest today from Wayne State University. Rachel, if you'd like to introduce yourself and get started.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Clark, as Mark said. I'm the Collection Strategy and Assessment Librarian and the liaison to the School of Information Sciences at Wayne State University. I'm also a member of the ProQuest Products and Platforms Advisory Group. I've been a member since October 2021, and we started talking about ProQuest's AI platform integration research assistant during the summer of 2023. It was such a great experience to be behind the scenes during development and to be in the position of an advisor and beta tester. There were such great conversations about how this tool could be useful and the things as librarians that we wanted to see in a tool that would help us do our jobs and not replace us as a profession. Because of course, there's so many things. I'll talk later about information literacy, but there's a definite role for librarians to use these AI integrations. So I think it's important to tell you that I am not an avid AI user. I'm totally a novice. Not because I don't want to use it, but I'm really concerned about the environmental impact. And I know many of you share that concern. I don't want to use AI for things like, what color should I paint my room? Or how would it look if I cut my hair into a bob instead of keeping it long? So I try to use it for things when I really need to, or when I can't avoid it, because it's just part of my interactions. So I think before I dive into telling you what's happening with AI in our campus and our policies, and that's very much in alignment with what Mark was talking about, I want to tell you a little bit about our university. We're an urban institution located in Midtown Detroit, Michigan, 6 miles from the Detroit River that divides the US from Canada. Wayne State, for 2 years now, has been ranked in the top 100 public universities by US News and World Reports. We're a Carnegie R1 institution with a very high research activity as measured by the official investments and doctorate production. We have 5 libraries. There's one for law, medicine. We have 2 on our central campus for they're called the graduate and undergraduate libraries, but they're used by everybody, literally everybody across campus. And we also have the Walter P. Reuther Library that has a special focus on organized labor archives. So it's a really special library. Fall enrollment this year is just over 24,000 students. We have 375 plus programs across 13 schools and colleges. So it is a big university. So AI activity is everywhere and not necessarily coordinated. And everybody's trying to figure out, things like policies and guidelines and how do we engage with AI in an academic setting. So one of the biggest things that's happened, because AI is evolving quickly and its use is increasingly ubiquitous, The Academic Senate formed an ad hoc AI committee last year. They spent the year having really lively discussions and trying to figure out what to do as an institution, how to respond to AI, how to use it. And they have some recommendations that came out of it that are things that Mark already talked about, but things like we need a standing committee that's going to continue to monitor and try and respond to the changes. Um, they want to develop an AI misuse statement, so kind of the ethics um, and more policies. They want policies on academic and instructional use. They want policies on research use. Um, they developed syllabus language that has been integrated across syllabi in all departments that talks about AI, but in a very general sense because it has to apply to everybody. Um, they want help in being able to evaluate all of the marketing that's coming into our inboxes on AI trainings and webinars, because some of it's really high quality and some of it seems like it's just trying to get money from us to teach us something that may not be really what we need to learn. Um, they're talking about some really interesting things about how AI can be used for assistive technology, which is just, it's one of those really wonderful things. Like, I think I'd be okay with environmental impact if it means we're increasing access to resources and making things equitable for everyone. Um, they also want some practical things like a centralized AI resources website, because currently we have AI information in multiple places, like I'm sure many of you. Um, and wait, this isn't jumping forward. There we go. So one of the places where we have policies is, or actually the main policy that we have available is on the university's computing and IT website. They are the people who have really developed our policy and created some guidelines for us, but they focus on those issues of things like data security and privacy, security risks. It's fascinating to look at how AI is being used for phishing and online scams. There was a whole section on the website that talked about in meetings how to spot when someone, an attendee that you don't recognize, may not actually be a real person and might be an AI um, fabrication, which was, I don't think I've ever encountered that, but sometimes I'm in big meetings, I don't know. But very interesting. They also have some definitions. They define the differences between AI and generative AI, and they talk about LLMs, large language models, to make sure we all have a shared vocabulary. Um, there's also this chart that you see on the slide of our approved generative AI tools. And it shows who can use them, students, faculty, staff, and whether we have a site license or if it requires an additional cost. And as you look at the names of those, you may notice that they're not the ones that our students are using. ChatGPT isn't there, Proximity isn't there, any of the other big ones that you hear about or maybe use yourselves, they're not on this approved list. So that's a limitation. We do have Warrior GPT because our university mascot, our sports teams are Warriors. Warrior GPT is a homegrown generative GPT, and I'm not sure how sustainable that is to try to continue development of something like that, especially as we move forward. It's also limited to integration in courses within Canvas. So it does have some limited application. So other places where we have AI activity happening on campus, um, our Office for Teaching and Learning, which we call the OTL, and I'll continue to call it OTL for this, um, and the university libraries were both really active in navigating AI and helping to try and lead things on campus. Um, our OTL has a faculty community teaching circle for AI pedagogy. It's a place where faculty from all across the university can come together and they can share their frustrations. They can share experiences and strategize how to adjust their teaching methods and the curriculum when students are increasingly using AI to write discussion posts and papers, and as Mark mentioned, do math problems. The faculty they're all talking about it and trying to figure out what to do. And some of the things that have come out of the teaching circle, I learned about experiential learning. One of the faculty has created some really great environments for students to engage with historical figures and conduct interviews with them. She built um, the information that the interface could use to create that experience, but it's just a wonderful way of showing the opportunities for how AI can be used to actually get students involved. And she said that before she did that, um, classes, students would engage with the material that she prepared, maybe the 3 or 4 times required for the assignment. Once she created an AI interface, students were going there for fun and showing their friends. And she said it just went up into like engagement became over 100 interactions. So it's pretty exciting. And I love that we have this teaching circle so those stories can be shared. Um, OTL also offers a lot of workshops and trainings throughout the year, and we do share space in one of our libraries with OTL. So the libraries are often involved. We collaborate whenever possible and support each other's work. Um, in the libraries, we have a LibGuide for AI. It's got content on things like ethics, copyright, citations, how do you cite something from that's AI generated. So we're trying to give guidance for faculty, students, the community, everybody on how to do that, each other. Um, the LibGuide also has a module on information literacy and critical thinking skills that are needed for AI tool use in an academic setting. The module was developed in collaboration with OTL, and it's based on some modules that were developed by a similar team at the University of Maryland, and they generously um, have a Creative Commons license to allow other people to use it. So we adapted it to suit our needs. Um, so other ways that AI is impacting the libraries is in collection development. Let's see. So a lot of the electronic resources that we interact with they've either already introduced or they're developing AI integrations into the platforms. So these are things that we have to constantly stay aware of because they have varying levels of transparency and varying levels of costs. Some of them are just integrated and we have them. Some of them are available for an additional charge. And so there's a lot to think about there. And in my experience and in talking with my colleagues and talking with other members of the advisory group for ProQuest, the librarians really want to understand how and which information is being used. What drives that large language model? What is going to drive the answers that we get? And um, there's a lot there to understand, but the more transparent the vendors are with us, the more comfortable I think we'll all feel using these tools. So speaking about policies, we recently updated our collection development policy, and I was part of that working group. We had so many conversations about AI and how we should address AI in our policy. Ultimately, we decided that we don't want to include anything at this point, but we've created our policy as a living document that can allow us to make adjustments to it, additions, changes as needed. So I think we'll have something coming there fairly soon. And I want to shift now from policies to information literacy. So the image on the right is probably really familiar to you. It represents the 6 frames of the ACRL framework. The framework was adopted in 2016, so that is 9 years ago. The framework document's introduction references rapid, dynamic changes in higher education and information systems. So it was purposefully crafted to focus on fundamental concepts of information creation and use. And it's not necessarily addressing modalities. AI literacy rightfully has a seat at the table along with all the other information literacies, including digital literacy, data literacy, visual literacy, media literacy, and you know that list goes on and on. So lately, I've been particularly interested in the relationship between information literacy and student agency. As I was preparing for today's talk, I began with a Google search. I always start with a Google search to just see the landscape. I wanted to just kind of see what was being written about and if any of the things that I was thinking are out in the general, world. And the AI overview that I got is on the left-hand side of the slide. It was at the top of my Google results, so naturally I read it. And I thought it really resonated with what I was thinking and what I'm hearing from colleagues. Effective use of AI tools requires traditional information literacy skills such as critical thinking and source evaluation, and the importance of helping students understand that AI, like any information source, can be inaccurate and biased. I was curious to see if Google's AI overview would change if I did the same search again. All I did was just enter it again. And the results did change slightly, but enough that I saw evidence of my own inability to predict how algorithms can affect search results. I thought that was a really valuable experience. So then I was really bolstered by my success with that first search, and I modified it a little, a couple more times. I did another search where I adjusted it slightly to just information literacy and student agency. And again, I thought it covered some of the things that I felt were really important. Things like critical thinking, bias, and misinformation. But it also included something that I think is important for librarians to keep in mind. Students are shifting from being passive consumers to active co-creators. This was said within the context of AI. Oh, goodness, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. I'm talking about how I adjusted to add the impact of AI. Still super relevant. But the idea that students as active co-creators is, I think, representative of their expectations for how they're going to engage with their studies, with learning. And it seems like a really marked change brought about by the technology. And I think it's going to impact how I interact with students, how I think about how they're going to receive the information that I give, how they want to engage with it, very much user experience. And this year, we just entered into, every year we have a year of focus with a special topic. This is our year of AI in action, where we're exploring the intersection of AI, innovation, and social impact. It's a year-long initiative, and the libraries are really well positioned because the committee's co-chaired by the Dean of Libraries, Paul Brackey. And yesterday we held our first event of this year of focus. It was in the library auditorium, and we had Dr. Sophia Noble. She is an author and a professor, and she was there speaking with us on algorithmic bias and social impact. The event was super well attended. We had people from all across campus, And she gave us so much to think about as we're moving forward, so much that applies to AI. And if you haven't read her book, Algorithms of Oppression, I strongly recommend it. And thank you. I want to turn things over to Stephen.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And I think for those listening, you can tell what a thoughtful and valuable person Rachel would be to have guide you throughout this process, as she's been to us during this beta of the research assistant on ProQuest. It's been great to collaborate with you and consult with you throughout the years now. Thank you for that presentation, which I also thought was really interesting and insightful. So I'm going to start by just grounding in some of our perspectives about AI. I know I just have about 10 minutes. I'm going to kind of go through this fairly quickly so we have time for Q&A. We talked about a lot of the opportunities, but also the concerns about AI use. And our approach is encapsulated in this framework here. So we use, obviously, transparency is really important to inform our customers about how our features are created, and also making it clear to end users how the features work. It also includes attributing AI answers to source material, which engenders trust as well. Ethical development includes, there's a lot of things that go along with the umbrella of ethical development, including the environmental concerns that we talked about earlier, but there's also things like ensuring collaborations with publishers for using AI on their content and partnering with people in the academic community to help steer our AI features responsibly. And then making sure our features are safe in the sense of mitigating risks of bias, hallucination, and data privacy. So having humans in the loop and actually guiding the process is crucial. We have an editorial team that stress tests all of our features. They highlight shortcomings, and they work back and forth endlessly with our technology teams to improve the quality and accuracy, which definitely elevates what it would be without humans involved in the process. And then making sure that we put privacy and security of user and publisher data front and center, so we don't train our AI models with user interactions, and make sure that all the interactions are sandboxed within our environment. So this is the ProQuest Research Assistant as it's been throughout the beta period. And it's basically a tool that we envision to aid in evaluation and discovery of scholarly materials. So there are basically two things that it does. One of them is to analyze the document that's being viewed, help the user analyze the document, really to help them evaluate the relevancy of according to their research task, and then to be an outlet to find further scholarship. So during the beta period, we had a multimodal approach where we had a lot of one-on-one interviews to get some good qualitative data and attitudes, more general attitudes about AI. We did hundreds of usability tests and activities to understand how people might want to use tools in an academic setting, their concerns that they have, and then conducted surveys, and then had multiple advisory board reviews with librarians and others to make sure that we were going along the right path. So here are just some kind of general observations and learnings. I'll get into kind of specific features and what we learned about our platform, but I figured I'd pull out some kind of general things that might be more broadly applicable. So one is that time scarcity is really the thing that is driving tool adoption. In a previous ACRL choice webinar, we talked about the way that the experience is changing for students. And one of the aspects is just the time crunch nowadays is such a huge factor for students, especially as the financial situation is harder in terms of getting a university education or college education. People are working more during their education, and the time crunch is real. So anything that can save them time is something they're going to be gravitated towards. The second point is really about students grappling with the ethical landscape of AI. So you see a lot of headlines about how students are cheating and using it for plagiarism. Well, I'm sure that is true, and it's hard to get an exact number of the people that are and are not doing that. It's important to note that we have a ton of responses and feedback from students that are concerned with maintaining academic integrity from their own motivation of wanting to learn and be honest and have integrity. So, but they say they lack guidance. They're not exactly sure how to use it in an ethical way. So some just avoid it entirely. Some use it and just have to find their own way and kind of develop their own standards of when not to use it. Also, there's a desire for agency in research interactions. So like we have a core set of features, which I'll show, that help with kind of common tasks about like evaluating what are the important concepts of the document, whether, can you summarize some of the findings of the document, but users really want to ask it in their own way and be able to have an experience that is customized and personalized. Something that is surprising is that, to me at least, those who engaged with the research assistant on ProQuest actually read and used the scholarly materials on ProQuest more than those who didn't. I'll get into that in a little bit. There is a small but really passionate group of users who are against use of generative AI in any form. And that is, I think, out of all the negative side of the feedback during the beta program, almost all of it was kind of a blanket opposition against AI in academia. A lot of environmental concerns. And while it's a small group compared to the total, it is definitely a passionate group of users who are against it. And then the last point is really just about transparency, which I touched on before, but I think when we can link back to the source text that is used to support claims made by generative AI, users are much more confident in using the tools. So I just have a couple minutes here. These are some of the features that we created throughout the year and a half that it's been online. So these are mainly aimed at quick evaluation of the document. We've done some redesigning based on the beta feedback, kind of organizing the panel into areas where there's kind of AI insights that you can get, and then also outlets for other scholarship, like the similar documents. We've recently expanded into visualizations as well, which is really proud of the feature because we've heard so much from people that say they're visual learners, and we got a lot of good feedback about how this helps them really just quickly understand the topics being discussed in a way that text, walls of text don't. So those are just quick overview of our features. And then I'll probably end on a couple slides here just about what people say and then what they do. Here's some just quotes from people that have used the features. I think I'm going to highlight this one at the bottom. Just the initial stages of reviewing articles is overwhelming, and this helps to maintain focus. So this is just about a feature that really just pulls out the concepts, gives a brief definition of the concepts being discussed. Most of the positive comments are about this helped me evaluate whether or not this is a valuable thing to spend more of my time on, or if I should look for another document that is more on my topic. There is such an overwhelming amount of articles and scholarship on databases that you could spend all day reading articles and still not find the one that is really right on the mark on the one you want. So that's one of the key tasks that we want to help with. And in terms of when we ask people on the survey on our website, how useful was it for your task? About 85% rated it as helpful or very helpful. And then I like this comment down here, how the person said, this is great, but they wanted to assure us that they don't use AI when writing papers. So I thought uh, that was a nice comment. And then when we look at our analytics, I thought this was interesting too. Just users who see a research assistant on a document they're 31% more likely to start scrolling and engaging with the document than people that don't see it on that same document. And then they're also more likely to use the document to cite, download, print, etc. And then, people that use it are more likely to come back to ProQuest regularly, about 70% more often than those who don't. Which, I think before we launched this, we assumed that, we didn't know how it would impact behavior at all. And a lot of the assumptions were that our fears were that it would decrease engagement and people would just kind of use it as a shortcut and not read the article. But it seems like, at least in this context, it's promising in the other direction. And I know we're at 11:50 here, so I think I'll probably skip ahead and I'll just talk really quickly about this. We have a new chat feature where you can ask your own question. So delivering on like the number one feature that people really wanted us to deliver on. And I think similar to before we launched it, there were a lot of concerns. People can type anything in this box. They can just like ask it to write the paper for you, which we don't let them do. But here are the types of questions that they do ask. So really finding specific pieces of evidence in the paper. Does this talk about this one issue that I care about? Please define this term that I don't understand, things like that. So just wanted to share this slide, and we'll pass it along after so you can evaluate it more thoroughly. But I thought it's interesting to see how people actually use these tools when you get them in the wild. And with that, I'm gonna go on to pass it back to Mark.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. And thank you, Rachel, as well. That was great. We have a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to make sure we get to the ones for you, Rachel, first, so we can make sure we answer them live, but answer anything that's in the chat afterwards, after we're done today. Here are the additional links that I'd mentioned. So for the microliteracy course, please, if you're up for taking that, 8 weeks, every Monday, you'll get a new email. Pulse of the Library report is available here on October 30th. So if you capture the QR code, you'll have that link when it becomes live on the 30th. We also have a number of products that include the ProQuest Research Assistant, so you might be familiar with some of those. Stephen's walked through some of these features already, and if there is an interest in having a trial to kick the tires and see how it works, please do let us know. Finally, we're going to walk through Q&A really quick. We've just got a couple of minutes. Rachel, there were a couple for you specifically that I wanted to ask. One was around what happens when an employee uses an unapproved AI tool for work tasks. Is that something you've run into?
It's an interesting question, and I think it's something that's happening all the time on our campus. And there really isn't anybody monitoring. There hasn't been any fallout. So as of now, what happens? Nothing.
Okay. Not a related question, but one for you. What kind of uptake have you seen from students using the AI literacy module in the LibGuide?
That's
are you
such a good
advertising
question.
it? Yeah. Is it integrated into classroom discussion? Tell us about that.
I saw the question in the chat and went, I want to know that too. So I pulled up our LibGuide statistics and dug in a little deeper, and I am sad to report that it is not getting heavily used. It's getting very little use. So I think there's an opportunity for us to do some marketing there, let faculty know it exists, and see what we can do to maybe build it into a LibWizard or something that could be more easily integrated into coursework. But thank you for the question.
Great question. There were a lot of questions around environmental impact. I just wanted to let you know in the Pulse of the Library report that's available on October 30th, there's a whole section that talks about equitable access, environmental impact, and a number of other related issues. So I just walked through the report, which is available internally, and it walks through that and talks through the regional differences in those responses. So you will be able to get some answers once the report is publicly available. Um, let's see. Any thoughts about how the AI bubble bursting will impact libraries? Great question. We don't know the scale, and the hypothesis around the AI bubble is a very interesting one. Sabrina is going to answer that question. I just saw that pop up in the chat. Have we looked at undergraduate versus graduate student use? We have in many cases. And of course, we have a number of research assistants available through Clarivate where graduate students and scholars are using research assistants for things like literature reviews. Others are using it more to understand the relevance of a document to their search, for instance. So it is a pretty broad divide between how undergrads and graduate students are using it. I don't think that's expressly mentioned in the Pulse of the Library report. I think we do have some of that information from the AI literacy course, though, which I'd be happy to dig up and look for you. Let's see. There was a question about whether or not the AI agent can identify retracted articles. I think I answered that already. We don't have something like that native in the platform, but that is a feature that we've been asked to explore, not just in the Research Assistant, but in our native platform. That, oddly enough, was also next to our most requested feature, which was the chat feature that Stephen had just mentioned. So we have been asked about that before, and certainly there are sources like Retraction Watch and other things that we could potentially integrate. So it's a great question. It's becoming a common feature request that we get, so we're certainly exploring what that might look like either in the Research Assistant or within the native platform. Question about Africa, challenges with digital divide and infrastructure. We do talk about the Global South in the Pulse of the Library report and some of the differences in responses. I can't speak to them without the report up directly right now, but I urge you to download that to get more of those regional flavors to any of the questions that we ask across all the respondents. Also, how many respondents were in the US versus not? The majority were in the US, so I think it was slanting at about 46% were US. The full breakdown will be available in the Pulse of the Library report, but that at a high level is the breakdown between US versus North America versus global respondents. Rachel, can you provide any more details about Warrior GPT and how it works? What types of things a student or a faculty member would actually use it for? Doesn't sound like there's necessarily a lot of use on it right now.
Unfortunately, I have never used it because it seems to be available for faculty and student use and has to be integrated into the Canvas site in order to use it. And I
Okay,
have not gone to any of the trainings for it because it's not really relevant for what I do. Um, I'm sorry, I
that's
don't have more information.
that's very good. Let's see.
There's an interesting question in the chat on whether or not it's okay to not accept AI or to be heavily against it as a library worker. And what does it mean to not adopt or comply and counter critically the dominance of the tech companies in this space? And this, can I respond to this?
Yeah, please.
Greg, I think this is an excellent question, and I think it's really important that there are people who are questioning how technology is changing things and the adoption of technology and what the potential risks are. In Sophia Noble's talk yesterday, she talked a lot about technology and the changes that are being driven by corporate America. And I think I want to encourage you to keep asking questions, challenge your colleagues, be involved in the dialogue because your perspectives are going to inspire deeper thought in those areas. And I do absolutely think it's okay to not be completely embracing AI at this point.
There was a question, I think we got time for one more question. Felicia asked if we'll consider writing a course focused on policy formulation for use of AI in academia. That is one of the weekly topics in the AI literacy course, that micro course that I mentioned initially. So we do have some material coming from a librarian that's representing that view. So you can find that within the full scope of the AI literacy course if you want to join that. So there's a lot of questions. We will get to the questions and answer them offline. We appreciate all the interest. There's a lot of great questions around user testing. There's also questions around different perspectives between community college versus academia, and how the data in the Pulse of the Library report is different between them. So we're happy to address those by looking at the Pulse of the Library report, but also answer these more generally across the full AI team. So we do appreciate everyone's time and attention today, and all the great questions as well. Thank you, Rachel and Stephen, for joining us as well. Back to you, Sabrina.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I'll just echo you and say thanks so much to Rachel, Stephen, and Mark for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you so much to our attendees for your questions and your comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice with a link to the recording and the slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from this session and hope to see you again soon on another webinar.